Hi everybody, this is Dr. Bianchi, and in this short lecture clip, I'm going to help summarize some of the most common research tools and methods that we have for addressing behavior, cognition, and emotion in the field of psychology. So this video is going to be a nice summary of all of the different techniques that are available to researchers who are interested in studying either human or non-human behavior. As we've already talked about, the scientific method is a framework that psychologists and all scientists use in order to test out their predictions and their ideas about how they think events that they're interested in work and hang together. So let's go ahead and look at some of the most common research tools that we have in the field of psychology that allow us to collect information about behavior and mental processes. There are several tools available that we're going to focus on in this class. We have case studies, surveys, observational methods, correlational studies, and experiments. So we're going to walk through each one of these methods that we have and get a little bit more familiar about not only what it is, but some of the pros and cons associated with each one of these tools. The case study is essentially an in-depth study of one particular person or perhaps a small group of people. The case study is usually reserved for really rare clinical cases or diseases that we just simply don't see a lot of. Okay, that might be some kind of rare condition that only one person has or a few people have. And these clinical case studies essentially allow us to study that individual or that small group of people in great depth through interviews, observation, written records, and we learn a lot about that individual or that small group of people. This picture here is of a man named H.M. He is one of the most famous case studies in the history of psychology. He was famous because he underwent surgery to brain surgery to cure or reduce the seizures associated with his epilepsy. Okay, he had really, really bad epilepsy. And what happened during his brain surgery was that part of his hippocampus was accidentally removed. And we'll talk more about that when we cover memory. But he was of really big scientific interest to individuals who were interested in learning and memory, because we realized that after HM's hippocampus was removed, he could no longer form new memories about his own life. So a case study is essentially one person or a small group of people who are of scientific interest to us because they're either diagnosed with some really rare condition or they have some kind of disease that we just don't see a lot of. Okay, we end up getting a lot of in-depth information, but remember, this info probably only applies to that person or the small group of people, and it may not generalize to everybody else. Surveys are a very common method of obtaining data in the social and behavioral sciences. Through survey research, psychologists are able to gather info about attitudes, behaviors, all sorts of questions of interest. These surveys can be administered to many, many people, and you get a lot of data. Okay, we can all remember taking a survey at one point or another. We have to remember that these are self-reports. Okay, the person is telling us about the way they behave, and we know from research that self-reports about behavior don't always match what people actually do. First of all, people can be dishonest when answering survey questions. Also, people just might not know the answers to the questions depending on how they're worded. This is why if you ever create a survey, it's important that you write good questions that people can read, understand, and remember the answers to. If you ask me how many calories I consumed last week, I don't know the answer to that. Unless I was tracking that or really keeping tabs on that, I just can't remember or answer that question. I don't know the information. Surveys are great. They're a cheap way to get a lot of data. Okay, you can get a sense for what's going on. They can be really good for asking about topics that are private or more sensitive. Okay, anonymous surveys where people's names are not connected in any way with the data can make people more apt to open up and report certain kinds of behaviors that may be more private or sensitive. But we always need to be cautious with surveys. Okay, again, people are telling us what they do, and we don't know it's actually what they do. Okay, a great place to start your research, get a sense for what's going on, but there are limits. Naturalistic observation is a really cool way to observe behavior. And just as the name implies, this means that you go out and you watch the individual in their natural habitat. Okay, here we can imagine that we're out watching these animals in their natural habitat. We can even do that with people. Okay, here's some kind of group discussion, or maybe this is some kind of group meeting, and we have individuals watching them through a one-way window, okay, getting a sense of the natural behavior of how this group interacts. Okay, when we know we're being watched, we change our behavior. So naturalistic observation is great because it's unobtrusive. The individuals being watched and studied don't know they're being watched. And overall, the goal is to get a more realistic view of the individual's own behavior. You might remember the famous primatologist, Jane Goodall. She spent many, many years observing the natural behavior of chimps out in the wild. Okay, a lot of times zoo-like environments or lab environments can give us sort of an artificial view of behavior. Naturalistic observation is really cool. It allows us to see what's going on in those real environments that the individual not only lives in, but has evolved and adapted in. Typically in research, we're not interested in one variable. Okay, after we've done some observation or we've gotten some survey data back, we're typically interested in researching whether there are connections or relationships among different variables of interest. Okay, once you've done some basic observational work, you can see if two variables are connected to one another. For example, is caffeine consumption linked to academic performance? Is water consumption linked with weight loss? These are correlational questions. We can measure these variables in a group of people and see if they're connected in some way. Correlation is just a fancy word for a relationship. Okay, are there connections or links between these two variables of interest? It's important to note that even if we can demonstrate a correlation between two things in the real world, it doesn't mean that they cause one another. Just because I do a research study and I show that caffeine is linked with better grades in class, it doesn't mean that drinking coffee is going to cause you to have a 4.0 GPA. Okay, correlations are a great place to start. They show us that there's a connection between two variables, but we have to remember we don't know why that connection exists. And sometimes that connection can be due to what we call a third factor, or another variable that explains that connection. Okay, a famous example is that there's a positive correlation between the amount of ice cream sold and the number of drownings that occur. Now, most of us are not going to say that ice cream causes drownings, okay, even though there's a correlation there. What we know is that it's really the hot weather that's causing that relationship. So when it's hotter out and warmer out, people are not only buying more ice cream, but they're also swimming more, okay, causing that correlation. Here are some other correlations. Okay, here's the temperature outside on the x-axis and the amount of beer sold. Okay, more people drinking cold beer when it is hotter out. The opposite effect, a negative correlation for the amount of hot coffee sold. Okay, when it's 110 degrees in Tucson, we probably don't want a hot latte. It doesn't really sound very appetizing for most of us. Okay, this is a negative correlation. As temperature goes up, amount of hot coffee goes down. Now, the final research method and tool I want to talk about is called the experiment. The experiment is our most sophisticated and powerful study design. Not every research study is an experiment. Okay, an experiment is a particular type of research study, and it has characteristics in it that allow us to make inferences about cause and effect relationships. In experiments, the researcher directly manipulates one variable, which we call the independent variable, to see if it has an impact on an outcome variable, which we call the dependent variable. Okay, that outcome variable is thought to depend on the independent variable. So here's an example of an experimental question. Does caffeine consumption cause higher grades? If I were going to do an experiment on this, I would have to take a sample of students randomly assign them to different groups, okay, of high and low doses of caffeine and maybe a control group where there's no caffeine. And I would have to get measures of their grades before coffee and after coffee consumption to see if it was actually the coffee that was able to account for the change in grades. Okay, here's another example of an experimental design I put together. The hypothesis is that stress impairs learning and memory. Okay, if you're really stressed out, it's going to interfere with your learning and memory. Well, here's a basic experimental design. We could have two groups of people. One group gets exposed to lab-induced stress, and the other group is in a control condition where they don't get stressed out in the lab. Now, it's important that we would randomly assign participants to the group. Okay, so people don't get to pick what group they're in. They're randomly assigned to either the stress or no stress group. And then we can measure learning and memory performance using a computerized task in both groups. Okay, the prediction is that the stressed group is going to perform worse. Okay, if the data come out that way, it supports our hypothesis. If not, we might need to refine the way we're thinking about this. It would be even more compelling if a week later, we bring the same people back and we switch the groups. Okay, the people who were stressed initially are now in the no stress condition, and vice versa. For the non-stressed folks, they do get stressed out, and we see if that changes their learning and memory performance. Okay, this is an experiment. We are randomly assigning individuals to different conditions of our study, stress and no stress, to see if it has an impact on their learning and memory performance. Okay, so I hope that this video has been helpful for you. In summary, we have a variety of different research tools and designs that are available for us to test out ideas about behavior. It's important to realize that a question can be studied using multiple techniques. There is no perfect study, and any study design is going to come with its pros and its cons. The methods that you use to investigate any question are going to not only depend on the question itself, but also on what you have available. What's your budget? What available resources do you have? Okay, all of these are going to be at play when deciding how to conduct a research study. Okay, so that's going to wrap up this video on research methods and tools. This should supplement the reading in your book, also going through all of these methods. I hope that this has been helpful, and I will be seeing you in a future video. Okay, thank you, everyone.